Hello students, today we are going to discuss a very important social institution, that is marriage. We're going to try and understand what is marriage, what are the various types of marriage, what are the various taboos that inform marriages. We are also going to try and understand marriage as a form of economic exchange, and finally we're going to look at some feminist interventions which try and understand the gender inequality that is a part of marriage as an institution. Now, what is marriage? Marriage is an almost universal social institution, and it takes different forms and meanings across cultures and different historical periods, which means what is marriage is something that is historically changing. It is generally seen as a legitimate or socially approved sexual and economic union, and it's conventionally between a man and a woman. Children born to women in marriages are recognized as legitimate offsprings of both the parents. Marriage tends to confer social status to a child and determines matters of inheritance and succession. Now, what are the important functions of marriage? Now, marriage basically is the social way of regulation of sexuality and human reproduction. As I told you, that children born within families are seen as children belonging to both the parents. It engenders a sexual division of labor. So within marriages, what happens is that two spouses perform different kinds of activities. They're generally complementary in nature. So men perform particular activities, women perform particular activities. It also functions as an important mechanism for sharing economic resources between spouses and children. And finally, the institution of marriage is an important agent of socialization. As you know, that ultimately it is the marital relationship that would constitute families, and as we've already discussed, family is an important agent of primary socialization. Now, when one enters into marriage, one gets a new set of relatives, right? These are referred to as affinal kins or in-laws. Now, it is important to understand that marriage is never simply about individuals. It is about groups, because what happens is that affinal relations of one generation become consanguineous relations of the next generation. So say, for instance, when a man and a woman marry and they reproduce, their children becomes their blood relative, even though the man and the woman are generally not related to each other. Marriage are not only then about spouses and children, they also become important mediators between two different groups. Now, what are the various types of marriages? We're going to look at quite a few types. We will begin with, of course, the most prevalent form of marriage in modern society, which is the monogamous marriage. In such a situation, you have one husband and one wife generally. Of course, with changes in law, monogamous marriages have been also extended to same-sex couples. Now, monogamous marriages are generally seen as a criteria for judging both modernity and civilization, right? So most states try to move towards monogamous marriages as the form of marriage practice. Now, we have polygamous marriages. Polygamous marriages constitutes more than one spouse at a given time, right? Now, most modern societies try to outlaw polygamous marriages because for some reason polygamous marriages is seen as backward, right? So those societies or those cultures which practice polygamous marriages are generally seen as uncivilized or backward, and monogamy then becomes a sign of civilization. However, polygamy was the prevalent practice prior to modernity, and a large number of societies actually practiced sort of polygamy prior to the sort of institutionalization of heterosexual monogamous marriages. Now, polygamous marriages can be of two types: polygyny and polyandry. Now, what is polygyny? Polygyny is a situation where men marry more than one woman. Right? Now, there are two types of polygynous marriages. When a man marries two or more sisters, it is referred to as sororal polygyny. And when the wives of this man, if he marries women who are unrelated to each other, then it is referred to as non-sororal polygyny. Now, what are the reasons for polygynous marriages, particularly in simpler societies, smaller societies prior to modernity? Now, the thing was that in smaller societies, men always, as members of clans, fought with other clans. So there was a lot of warfare, and also there was a lot of hunting. As a result, generally most societies had more women than men. Right? So the sex ratio was skewed and women outnumbered men. So in such a situation, what happened is that a man had to marry more than one woman, simply because an unmarried woman was seen as a social anomaly. Because for a woman to be a mother and a childbearer was so important that a man began to take more than one wives to actually balance out the excess number of women in a certain sense. Another reason why men married more than one woman is so that to ensure more children and more surviving children, because prior to modernity there was a high infant mortality rate, right? And in order for the father to continue having his own lineage, right, through which he could then transmit property, etc., it was very important for him to have children, right? And to maintain the lineage, then he would marry more than one wife. Another reason why polygynous marriages took place was obviously the postpartum sexual taboo, which is that after childbirth, generally wives for a certain period in some societies were not allowed to have sexual intercourse with their husbands, right? This was so that they could actually devote their time to taking care of the child. So it is during this period that men tended to marry other women, right? Another form of polygamous marriage is, of course, the polyandrous marriage. Now, what is polyandry? It's a situation where one woman marries more than one man. Now, there are two possibilities in this. When a woman marries two or more brothers, it is labeled as fraternal polyandry. And when the husbands are not related to each other, it is referred to as non-fraternal polyandry. Now, what are the reasons of polyandrous marriages? Firstly, polyandrous marriages are actually very rare. They are not very common, and they often happen when there is a shortage of women, right? And shortage of women can occur in societies which are generally very violent to women, right? Which sort of kill women, where there are practices of female infanticide, etc. So this shortage compels a situation where a woman is married to more than one man. Another reason why polyandrous marriages take place is that when a society has limited resources, where, say if a particular, group of people are living in a very difficult climate or very difficult topography, like for instance in Tibet, some groups have polyandrous marriages, and they have less cultivable land, etc. So in that situation, what they do is that polyandrous marriages, they keep the birth rate low, and because they keep the birth rate low, it ensures that the small group has a better standard of living and hence can survive. So these societies then resort to polyandrous marriages. Although very rare, they still tend to happen. Now, there is a lot of sort of academic literature on the relationship between co-wives in a polygynous marriages. Generally, polygynous marriages constitute a compound family where, if the wives are in a situation of sororal polygyny, which means that they are related to each other, they are sisters and they live under the same roof with their husbands, and they are generally cooperative and content with the marriage since they were already related to each other, right? But there is also a tendency to think of the relationship between co-wives as, one of conflict, rivalry, competition and jealousy, right? So much so there is this idea that, when one wife suffers, so say for instance, she gives birth to a stillborn child, or she is not able to reproduce a child, or she has particular diseases, there is a tendency that other wives are accused of witchcraft. This is a very common practice in smaller societies. Now, in order to mitigate the conflict between co-wives, there are various practices that are prevalent in societies, right? And particularly in the context of non-sororal polygynous marriages, right? The first is that co-wives live in separate quarters. So the best thing that the husband can do is maintain different households so that the wives don't get to interact with each other. Husbands are also required to follow a principle of strict equality in relation to its wives, which means that, you have to, say for instance, give the equal amount of time to each wife and spend, say, the equal amount of days with each wife. There is also the practice of grading wives. So wives are hierarchically graded. senior wives or chief wife tend to have higher social prestige than the sort of younger wives, right? And this is a kind of trade-off because, you know, as the senior wives would be generally older and the husband's sexual interests would probably be occupied by the younger wives. So a certain kind of social status and prestige is a way to compensate for this phenomena. Generally, a husband may also need permission in some societies to marry, another wife from the first wife. Another important form of marriages, particularly in simpler societies, is the levirate. That happens when a man dies. His wife may beget children from his brother or his sons from another wife. The children thus born are considered to be descendants of the deceased man, not the living member who sort of, begets the child, but the man who has died. The levir is the biological father, is generally not considered the husband of the deceased man's wife. Patrilineal descent groups like the Bedouins of Arabia and the Nuer in Sudan have levirate marriage practices. Now, the reason why you have levirate marriage practices is because the continuing lineage is so important that every man, every male member of the lineage group must be a lineage founding member, must produce heirs. So even if he dies, his brother on his behalf is supposed to then beget children in his name. An extreme sort of form of, and of course extreme in an ethnocentric fashion, because this, for those who practice it, it's just a part of their cultural practice, is that the necessity of having direct descendants may result in a woman's marriage to an unmarried dead man. This refers to an arrangement where again the brother of an unmarried deceased man marries and begets children on his behalf. In such a union, a woman is technically married to the man posthumously. This is also practiced in the Nuer. Both levirate and ghost marriages distinguish between the social father. In this case, the social father is either was married and died or died even before marriage, and then his brother, who's actually the biological father but not recognized as the social father or the husband of the wife, and he begets the children. It ensures the continuity of the brother's lineage. Sororate. Now, sororate is in some sense a reverse of the levirate form of marriage. Here is a marriage in which a man may marry or have sexual relations with his deceased wife's sister or the sister of a wife who is infertile. This is of course referred to as sororate. Such marriage ensures the continuity of alliance between husbands and wives' lineage group. So you see, when marriages take place, there are also other forms of economic exchange. So say sometimes a bride price is paid to get a wife. So if the wife dies or if she is infertile, then she is unable to perform the duties that were expected as a wife and mother. So as a kind of compensation for the bride price, the sister is given again in marriage to the same husband. This is the practice of sororate. Now, from the point of view of group relations, we can think of marriages in two ways. One is endogamy and the other is exogamy. Now, exogamy refers to the rule of marrying outside one's kinship group or community. Clans generally are exogamous units and tend to marry outside their groups and villages or groups of villages. These spouses invariably come from a certain distance, right? So keep this in mind, that exogamous marriages are a situation where you marry out. You cannot marry within your own group or your community. Endogamous marriages are reverse, right? These involve marital relations among members of the same community. The best example of endogamous marriages are basically caste marriages in India. As you know, that the operational unit of caste is jati, and caste groups marry within the same gotra. Gotra can be roughly translated to sort of family lineage. So the idea is that you marry outside your family lineage, but you marry within your caste group. So that makes it an endogamous form of marriage. Now, endogamous however, despite that, although generally, sort of within caste you have to have endogamous marriages, but you also have two other kinds of interesting marriage practices. One is the Anuloma, which permits the twice born caste, that is the Brahmins, Kshatriyas and Vaishyas, in which an upper caste man may marry a girl of a lower caste status. This form of marriage is acceptable. Pratiloma is a form of marriage where a lower caste man marries an upper caste woman. Now, this is generally condemned, right? Because this sort of upsets the aspect of caste ritual purity. So this is severely condemned. Now, there are some societies which actually allow cousins to marry, right? And Levi-Strauss specially talks about cross-cousin marriage as an elementary form of marriage that involves a positive rule where a certain kin is prescribed for marriage. Now, as you know, your cousins are in some sense your relatives. They are related to you. And in some societies, you can actually marry your cousins. Now, cross-cousin marriages can be of various types, according to Levi-Strauss. Cross-cousin marriage in which a man marries his mother's brother's daughter and a woman marries his father's sister's son is called a generalized exchange. Now, it's called a generalized exchange because what happens is, say if I'm group A, right, I marry into group ABC and my brother marries into group DEF. Right? So that leads to forging of marital relationships between many groups at the same time, hence a kind of generalized exchange. It creates stable alliances between different descent groups, and the groups are either wife givers or wife takers. So as I just said that, you know, with one set of groups you would only be taking wife, and in another set of group you would be giving women as wives to that group, right? Generally there is a hierarchical relationship between wife givers and wife takers, right? In some societies wife givers are more privileged, in some societies wife givers are takers are more privileged. Delayed direct exchange is another form of cross-cousin marriage when a man marries his father's sister's daughter and a woman marries his mother's brother's son. Such unions are rare and they produce unstable relationship. Why this happens is because you will see, because of this kind of marriage, in one generation, a woman goes to a particular group, and in the next generation, by this logic, if you sort of compute it, a woman will come from this very group. So each group becomes a wife giver and a wife taker sort of generationally. And this can create problem in sort of how to manage the relationship between two groups. Another form of cross-cousin marriage is the direct exchange, which involves two men exchanging their sisters. Such a situation entails marriage between cross-cousins on either side and creates very stable relations between moieties, which are two unilineal descent groups in a particular society. Now, parallel cousin marriage. Now, who are parallel cousins? Parallel cousins are simply basically the same-sex siblings of our parents. So basically mother's sisters and father's brothers. Parallel cousin marriages are relatively uncommon. Muslim societies tend to permit parallel cousin marriage, which is a kind of, it's of course a form of endogamy, because if you think about it, your parallel cousins belong to your own lineage group, right? So in that sense, it's not a very common form of marriage, and its acceptance has also been sort of deteriorating. But the reason why such forms of endogamous marriages happen, because it allows resources and women to stay within the same group or community. Now, this is something that a form of marriage that you may all have heard of, which is of course the arranged marriage, which is very typical of India. But these marriages engender social and economic ties between groups, parents and handlers in the kin group, and may play an active role in spousal selection subject to local incest taboo. So arranged marriage is a situation where two groups decide to marry individuals rather than the individuals exercising their own choice. In non-Western societies, marriages are often arranged by parents and individual choice, or romantic love is not the basis of such marriages. In many Asian and Eastern and Southern European countries, child marriages had actually been customary, where parents fixed marriage prior to sexual maturity of one or both partners. Now, in most societies now, child marriages is generally outlawed, but there are still instances where child marriage practices take place. Child marriage is, of course, one of the pernicious form of an arranged marriage, and it's mostly outlawed. The obverse of arranged marriage is love marriage, which is the predominant form of Western marital union. In Western industrial societies, where the significance of kinship ties declines, monogamous marriages are fundamentally choice-based. Modern marriages are intimately linked to romantic love, which is premised on or symbolized by sexual desire and satisfaction. According to Steven Steedman, this sexualization of love and eroticization of sex, or the acknowledgement that sex is an aspect of pleasure, self-expression and identity, are typical aspects of modern marriage. So here the idea is that it is sexual desire which is a part of love, and it is love that produces marriages, and marriages continue because of love and sexual satisfaction. So here love and sex are basically coupled in the form of a heterosexual marriage, and this is the dominant form of marriage. And because of cultural homogenization and processes of globalization, this is becoming the most acceptable form of marriage and a marker of modernity and civilization. Now, we have incest taboos. Incest taboos basically are rules of who you can marry and who you cannot marry, right? And all societies prescribe certain kinds of incest taboos. There are various theories behind these incest taboos, right? For instance, the theories include dangers of inbreeding, natural repugnance theory, maintaining the unity of the kinship group, and alliance theory. Now, explanations for incest taboo. One of the oldest explanation of incest is dangers of inbreeding. The idea is that children from blood relatives will actually have recessive genes and die early due to severe genetic disorders. This theory, however, does not convincingly explain how incest taboo was institutionalized in societies which had little biological knowledge. However, it is possible that because of certain kinds of demographic consequences of incest, they learned to actually not to have some incest rules so that there is a certain kind of demographic growth. Now, the natural repugnance theory states that we are naturally repulsed, we are not sexually attracted to our own relatives, right? Now, this theory, of course, has been critiqued by Sigmund Freud, who says that actually our gender identities are formed through repression of desires of the child for the mother or the father. So this is not a very popular theory. The most important sociological theory of the incest taboo was provided by Laszlo Malinowski, who said that incest is necessary for the maintenance of the unity of the kinship group, because absence of incest will create a certain kind of sexual competition and rivalry between the brothers for sisters and the mother, right? And this would compromise the unity of the family. Also, incest taboos create role conflict because the relationship between the husband and wife is very different from a relationship between a parent and child. So it's very important to maintain certain incest taboos whereby you cannot marry your own sister or you cannot be with your mother. Alliance theory actually states that incest taboo is interesting because it makes possible exogamous marriages. So it creates relations among groups, right? So when you marry outside your group, right, because of incest taboos, you actually create more general relations in society, and hence incest taboos become important. Now, marriage as a form of economic exchange. Now, through marriage, various kinds of economic exchanges happen. An important form of economic exchange is the bride price. Now, what is a bride price? A bride price is generally given to the wife's family, right? Now, what is the function of the bride price? The bride price is a kind of compensation for the loss of reproductive and productive labor in the bride's group that they incur. The bride's wealth also may be used to contract marriage for bride's brother later. Bride price acts as a form of security against poor behavior of the spouses. The payment of bride price also validates the marital union. The practice of bride price is more common in societies where women play an important role. Bride services are also activities undertaken by the groom prior to or after marriage for the bride's family. Bride service may vary in duration and is sometimes a substitute for bride price. Dowry is a substantial payment in cash or kind from the bride's side to the groom's family. It is given to secure the future of the bride and children. However, it is an exploitative practice and stems from cultural devaluation of women. In India, the practice of dowry is associated with male child preference and a range of violence against women, such as female feticide, infanticide, and physical and mental torture of wives, leading to its outlawing in India. Now, feminist interventions on marriage. Now, the heterosexual marriage involves a distinct sexual division of labor. Men and women are expected to perform different tasks and roles which are differentially evaluated in society. Men claim a higher status for their roles as husbands, and wives are expected to be submissive and obedient. Husbands tend to have domestic or economic rights. They claim sexual rights and rights over a wife's children. Now, according to Jessie Bernard, she says that it is always that the man's marriage is better than the woman's marriage. In a marriage, the woman undergoes a degradation of the self because she has to continuously cater to the husband. She has to continuously meet his demands, and in the process, her own self starts to dwindle. And women are also socialized to accept these social, psychological, and physical and health degradations that actually happen within marriages. And even though they suffer within marriages, they continue to believe in marriage and they think that it is the key to happiness. But studies show that women in marriages generally tend to suffer because of the inequality that characterizes marriages. Feminists have also drawn attention to the unpaid labor that women provide in marriages. They may include direct contribution and assistance to their husband's economic activity, so basically helping a man, sort of do his work. It also involves a range of emotional labor, care work, relationship work, whereby they provide regular sexual services to their husbands, they take care of the children and other family members, and finally, housework, which is repetitive, unpaid, invisible labor that wives perform in their household, whether they are housewives or working women. So in case of working women, they not only work outside for pay, but they have to come back home and continue to perform housework. Feminists have also highlighted the physical and sexual violence that women are subject to in marriages by their husband and in-laws, from wife battery, marital rape to verbal and emotional abuse. Feminist interventions have been important because they have led to important legal changes and also changes in the way in which society thinks about the position of women, and it has transformed marriage from a fundamentally patriarchal institution from which men and husbands benefit to a more egalitarian one. Hence, it is important to understand that marriage is a very important social institution, but it is undergoing change. And a very recent and important change is that various states are actually acknowledging homosexual unions, and there are, in many countries, you have a queer movement where they are trying to fight for marriage rights for same-sex couples, and many countries have actually achieved marriage equality. So marriage as a phenomena continues to change across culture and historical periods. Thank you.